The beginning of Ukraine's 2023 counteroffensive probably came as no surprise to anyone. Heavily telegraphed and discussed internationally and domestically, both Ukrainian and Russian sources generally agreed it was inevitably going to happen. But after several weeks of elevated activity at the front, well, there seems to be general agreement that something is happening. How it's going is heavily contested. On one hand, there's the extreme narrative that this whole thing has been a crushing Ukrainian failure, and that after the highly publicised loss of some Western-supplied materiel, Ukraine's offensive potential is exhausted or at least significantly depleted. On the other, there's the assertion that everything is going according to plan, something which seems difficult to believe given all the reporting of extremely difficult fights taking place. And so even though the fog of war remains thick and things remain relatively uncertain, today I want to try and piece together at least some of the reality of what we're seeing with the Ukrainian counteroffensive. Or, as Future Purim would like to note, as most of this episode was prepared before recent events, before Evgeny Prigozhin, the head of the Wagner Group, decided to launch one of the most long-shot anime betrayals in modern military history. And so while today's episode will focus on the battlefields of Ukraine, you can bet that we'll be coming back to talk about Mr. Prigozhin's efforts relatively soon. So what am I going to be talking about in this episode then? I'm going to start by giving a little bit of background to the offensive, covering the gap between when we last talked about the preparations and now. I'm going to discuss the last shaping operations that took place, as well as the catastrophe with the Kakhovka Dam. Then I'm going to spend the bulk of the episode discussing the June offensive so far, the performance and attrition inflicted on both sides, the logistics campaign that is sitting behind the battle for the front lines, and then an evaluation and assessment of how the fighting is going and what we might see next. Before we do, I'm going to add an even stronger caveat around information quality than I usually do. Determining what's going on in an active war zone is always difficult. I've talked about that challenge before. But in the case of the Ukrainian offensive over recent weeks, it's even more pertinent. Many normal Ukrainian sources simply aren't putting out information at the moment for reasons of operational security, so this video is based a lot more heavily on Russian sources and imagery data than it usually would be. Plus, more often than you usually would, you see sources sitting at odd points on the information spectrum relative to one another. That is normally where you would have most of your pro-Russian sources saying everything is some degree of fine or excellent for the Russians, and the pro-Ukrainian or Western sources vice versa. In the case of the recent weeks, these sources have in many cases contradicted themselves or swapped places entirely. So this video represents a best effort to make sense of it all, and I expect it will be some time before everything becomes much clearer. But the difficulty around getting different sources straight and trying to find the truth at the heart of the story does provide a little bit of a segue, and so let me welcome back a returning sponsor, Ground News. Comparing multiple sources is almost essential if you're going to avoid echo chambers in media reporting. Ground News is a combination website and app that helps you do exactly that, collecting thousands of articles and news stories every day and organising them in a way that makes them easy to compare. Looking at this story covering US aid to Ukraine, for example, Ground News lets you compare the headlines and even read the articles from each outlet without leaving the app, which can save me and you a great deal of time and effort. You can also hunt for stories that might be underreported by the left or right. This story on South Korean aid to Ukraine only had one left-leaning source reporting on it, whereas this story on the Pope had a shortage of right-leaning sources. And what's even better is you can actually filter coverage for stories that are coming out of a specific area, like Ukraine. So if you're looking for focused coverage, Ground News' new map feature is a great way to do it. In short, when you have a finite amount of time to compare and contrast news, Ground News can give you a more effective and efficient means to do so. So I'd encourage you to give it a try by clicking on the link in the description, which will offer you a 30% discount on their Vantage subscription. Alright, so let's quickly go over some background to the attacks that we're now seeing. While Ukraine focused on absorbing Russian offensives over the winter and spring, it always telegraphed an intention to eventually take back the military initiative. New units were being generated, in some cases using new equipment, specifically to help spearhead a new offensive. That certainly made sense from a strategic perspective. Ukraine's goals remain the liberation of its territory currently under occupation. And while sitting on the defensive and hoping that Russian willpower or military capability was eventually worn down might have been an option from a military perspective, Ukrainian leadership didn't seem particularly interested in the option of simply fighting it out and hoping that Russia burnt out or collapsed. Ukraine very clearly telegraphed an intention to put boots in trenches and to start taking back ground. For their part, Russia invested an immense amount of time and resources in preparing some very formidable fixed defences. The map on the right there charts some of those positions that are significant enough to be readily identified from space, and I give full credit to the work of Brady Afric there, and would encourage you to check out some of his work on Twitter. Now obviously each of these dots was not created equally. Some represent much more formidable positions than others, but there were some common general features: extensive minefields, the use of anti-tank obstacles and ditches, and of course intricate trench systems. The focus of Russian defensive construction was in the south of Ukraine, protecting the potentially quite vulnerable land bridge to Crimea. And in their layout, you can argue they broadly reflected Soviet and Russian defensive doctrine. Defensive schemes, according to that doctrine, would first have a security zone several kilometers in depth, and any attacker pushing into that security zone would suffer attrition from defenders, minefields, and indirect fire assets, with many of the guns and MLR systems delivering those fires being safely positioned behind echelon primary defences further back behind the security zone. Because contrary to what Game of Thrones might have told you, the optimum defensive layout doesn't usually consist of positioning all of your artillery outside your primary fortifications and getting them immediately overrun by the enemy. The precise objectives of whatever offensive would attack these defences would ultimately be known only to the Ukrainian High Command. But analysts and observers hypothesized a number of potential options: south to chop the land bridge to the Russian positions in Kherson and Crimea, perhaps east into Donetsk or Luhansk, or if some Russian propagandists were to be believed, some outside chances like a Ukrainian offensive through Belgorod towards Moscow or an invasion of Belarus. But wherever Ukrainian forces ultimately chose to attack, the steps that would be necessary in order to achieve success were likely to be more or less the same. In a best-case scenario, Russian defences would shatter as units ran, collapsed, or refused to fight. That, presumably, would be the easy option. If that didn't happen, what remained would be the hard option. That would mean setting conditions and then carrying out one of the most difficult types of operations an army can be asked to do, namely to breach a prepared enemy defensive position without air and fire superiority. In turn, doing that would probably require narrowing whatever advantage Russia had in local fires, forcing the commitment of reserves, the shaping of battlefield conditions, and then ultimately picking a time and location to make a concerted breakthrough attempt. And if that failed, to ultimately keep trying until something somewhere ultimately broke. Some had expected this operation to be launched by Ukraine in the spring, but instead, the period up to the first week of June was instead dominated by shaping operations and other interesting events. Some of these were purely informational or political, with different actors either trying to amp up expectations or tamp down expectations for Ukraine's eventual offensive. While this would have very little impact on how the military side of the offensive would play out, it would help shape later public perceptions. After all, if the public became convinced that the Ukrainian offensive would end in Crimea, then anything short of that, even if it was a military disaster, would still potentially look like a defeat for Ukraine. The opposite, of course, was also true. If everyone was to expect a grinding advance measured in meters per day, then even a slow grinding offensive measured in dozens or hundreds of meters per day might be made to look like a significant victory. The months of May and June also saw cross-border incursions from Ukraine into the Belgorod region of Russia. Up to this point, it had been rare for forces to cross from Ukraine into this internationally recognized Russian territory. But what we saw this time were relatively small-scale raids by small formations of Russians fighting as part of two volunteer Russian formations. Relatively small forces with small amounts of heavy equipment, maybe 1 or 2 tanks and a small collection of armoured vehicles and IMVs, were able to cross the border successfully. And in their second raid, beginning on the 1st of June, it took weeks for Russian forces to finally throw these volunteer units back across the border. The military damage done may have been relatively minor, but it proved how weak Russian border defences had become, and it may have been hoped that they would prompt Russian forces to concentrate more units along the border rather than the other areas where Ukraine's main forces would eventually strike, with the unpalatable alternative for the Russian government being trying to explain to its own people why the Russian military was so powerful that victory over Ukraine was ultimately inevitable, but at the same time was apparently so weak it was unable to stop a small raiding force from essentially squatting in Shevakino, not for hours or for days, but for weeks. Then there were a series of small Ukrainian advances around Bakhmut. Here, Wagner troops had been steadily withdrawn from the region to be replaced by Russian regulars, and it seems that Ukrainian forces leveraged the opportunity provided by that situation to begin pushing back on the flanks of the city. As far as we could assess from open sources, these actions by Ukraine didn't involve any of the new brigades that had been purposely created for the counter-offensive. Instead, they were launched by brigades with already familiar names, already known to have been in the Bakhmut area. And while it's impossible to know the details of what this operation was seeking to achieve, one potential explanation is that it was intended to fix and draw in additional Russian troops to defend Bakhmut. The Russians taking the city had not done what many pro-Russian sources argued it would. It did not crack open Ukrainian lines, it did not prove to be a key to the greater Donbass. Its strategic significance, as all along, was made up primarily by the fact that both sides had fought so hard for it. But having made such a public big deal out of capturing the city, Russian MOD presumably couldn't allow it to simply be retaken by the Ukrainians. And so Russian forces committed to defending it, and remain defending it to point of recording, because there are no costs quite like sunk ones. And while all that was happening, a series of strikes were being launched behind opposing lines, the Russians firing missiles and drones into Ukrainian territory, and Ukraine attempting to get full value out of the new reach that recently arrived Storm Shadow and Scalp missiles had now provided it. Ammunition depots, barracks, and warehouses would all be targeted, presumably with the goal of inflicting attrition on Russian forces, weakening the overall defensive scheme, and leaving the Russian command guessing where the final blow would fall. Because in a giant game of, hey, look over there, even if you know your opponent is trying to trick or distract you, it's kind of hard to ignore a 450-kilogram warhead landing in your mess hall. As shaping operations, these strikes were probably significant, but in terms of truly reshaping the battlefield that would eventually be fought over, they completely paled in comparison to what came next, namely the tragic destruction of one of the last great dams on the Dnipro River at Nova Kakhovka. Now, I thought long and hard about how to do this section, namely because, for reasons I fail to understand, the responsibility for the destruction of this dam has somehow become a significantly debated issue. And that leaves me in a difficult position for a video which is meant to be about the Ukrainian counteroffensive. Because if I provide only a cursory explanation of the events that apparently led to the destruction of the dam, that might be seized on by people saying that I'm not looking at the whole story or all of the arguments. But if I were to look at each of them in turn and truly do this event justice, well, it would come to dominate the video. For the civilian population, the impact was obviously immense. Not just were entire towns now underwater, homes partially submerged, but supplying the population with things like electricity or clean drinking water became suddenly much more difficult. Much of the affected population was on the Russian-controlled bank of the river. There, the Russians were criticised by the United Nations for denying access to relief organisations to those impacted areas. And at time of recording, the UN continues to, quote, urge the Russian authorities to act in accordance with their obligations under international humanitarian law, end quote. Militarily, however, the breach of the dam temporarily raised water levels dramatically. Before the breach, Ukrainians had set up many forward positions on the islands in the Dnipro River. They'd also been regularly launching raids across it into the Russian-controlled parts of Kherson. Following the breach, many of those forward positions were washed away, as were some of the Russian positions on the other bank. In the short term, the prospect of any Ukrainian offensive across the river dramatically decreased, and open source seems to suggest that some Russian units were redeployed to other fronts from Kherson following this incident. In the longer term, it is possible that some of these areas that used to be covered by water in the reservoir eventually become navigable by land-based vehicles. But even though the surface in many of these areas is likely to appear dry, the ground underneath is likely to still be soaked for some time. And so in the short term, the breach removed a number of Ukrainian military options, inflicted tremendous damage on the civilian population, struck a great blow to Ukrainian agriculture, endangered the water supply by canal to Russian-held Crimea, and reshaped the geography of this part of Ukraine for years to come. But even if the breach did potentially allow the redeployment of Russian forces or cancel any planned Ukrainian offensives across the river, it clearly didn't result in the cancellation of all of Ukraine's offensive plans, because starting particularly in early June, we began to see a genuine uptick in Ukrainian offensive activity, particularly in Zaporizhia. Here, most of what we saw seems to have been probing attacks carried out at a relatively small scale, small groups of infantry or armoured vehicles, poking essentially at Russian defensive positions. Usually these were not even the sort of company-scale efforts we might see a little bit later on, but rather things conducted at a platoon or even lower level. It was enough to let us know the Ukrainians might be trying to map out Russian defensive positions and test their strength, and it also provided an opportunity to see for the first time some more of the Western equipment that Ukraine had received over the last several months. But it wasn't, at least initially, a concerted push. But the information space was about as sedate as a hamster that had just eaten half its body weight in sugar, and many Russian commentators at the time could best be charitably described as jumpy. And so many of these smaller Ukrainian operations were reported as major attacks, which of course were gloriously repulsed. This is also the phase where the Russian Ministry of Defense started to claim the destruction of several Leopard 2 tanks and other pieces of Western military equipment. And as the calls for proof grew louder, eventually they released some real classics. Like these videos of Russian Kar-52 attack helicopters mercilessly terminating some Ukrainian farm machinery, which was then claimed, legitimately, by the Russian MOD as Leopard 2 battle tanks. For me, the remarkable thing here is not that Russia claimed to destroy tanks without having evidence for it. It's that they chose to release this as the evidence for the claim. Although, to be fair, given the historical anti-tank performance of Ukrainian tractors, perhaps the Russians felt that this particular engagement was justified. Levity aside, however, things would rapidly become more serious. So let's quickly go through the primary axes of advance. So what you're looking at here is a zoomed out map of the relevant section of southern Ukraine. I draw attention to the fact it's zoomed out because when we look at places like Bakhmut over the last several months, we tend to zoom the map right in so you can actually see it. Here we're looking at a truly strategic overview. This area taken together represents the famous Russian land bridge to Crimea. If you are looking to cut the rail and road networks that make up that land bridge, there's a couple of potential options. Reaching either Mariupol or Berdyansk, for example, would probably decisively do it. Along the way, there are also potential intermediate objectives that could be very valuable if taken. Tokmak, for example, stands out as being relatively close to the front line, but also being critical as a transport centre. There is no rail line running along the coast, instead it runs further to the north. And if that rail connection had been cut, there'd be significant implications for Russia. So far, we haven't seen Ukraine commit squarely towards any single geographical objective. Instead, we've seen pressure applied at different points all along the front, and I want to look at 3 key points now. Furthest to the west, there's been what I'm going to call the Vasilivka effort, named after the city to the southwest, that previously housed a number of administrative functions for the Russian occupation authorities in the region, although some of those functions have reportedly now been evacuated further to the south. This axis has seen incredibly heavy fighting over a tiny village. Piatihatki had a population of perhaps 300 pre-war, and yet it has been the site of a number of Russian counterattacks, vicious bombardments, and assault actions. A number of Russian sources claim that the village has been retaken multiple times through counterattack, but the best available evidence suggests that it's still in Ukrainian hands. The fighting here is still hard and ongoing, and the village of Zherebyanki is probably the next one in the Ukrainian crosshairs. Far further to the east, there's what I'm going to call the Velka Novosilka effort. In terms of total territory confirmed taken, this has been the most successful Ukrainian effort in the south so far. At time of recording, that was probably around 50 square kilometres on the primary direction of effort, with a question mark over how much further south this advance has gone. Evgeny Prigozhin, for example, has claimed the Ukrainians have already pushed considerably further south than this, threatening the supplies to Rivnopil. But he doesn't always qualify as the most trustworthy source. And as Future Perun would like to note here, he may have had some ulterior motives in mind when he made that statement. Back over to the west, finally, there is Orikhiv. Here, the most obvious direction of advance would seem to be due south through Robotne towards Tokmak. On one hand, this is probably the line of advance that faces the most extensive Russian fortifications and defences. On the other hand, it also represents the most direct path possible towards the valuable objective of Tokmak. If you want to analogize the Orikhiv effort to one of the beaches at D-Day, this is Omaha. It is the place where the Ukrainian attacks have received some of their stiffest resistance. And if you have seen videos of destroyed Leopard tanks or Bradley infantry fighting vehicles, many of those losses belong to a particular Ukrainian brigade fighting on this line of advance. In particular, there have been cases of vehicles being struck while still in assembly areas or ambushed while mid-minefield by enemy rotary-winged aviation. As at time of recording, the areas those ambushes occurred are believed to be under Ukrainian control, and the line is stated by some Russian sources to have moved somewhat further south, although by most accounts, Robotne itself is still very much in Russian hands. There are a few things to note about the pushes on each of these lines of advance. The first thing to say is even though some very heavy Ukrainian equipment is clearly being used in these movements, We have neither seen a commitment of the bulk of the forces we believe the Ukrainians to have available, nor have we seen much evidence of local attacks being particularly large in scale, with often quite small units being involved. And that probably shouldn't surprise us given what we've seen of the war so far. Concentrating large forces is dangerous when faced by opposing artillery, and it's also difficult to coordinate. And so we've tended to see both sides launching offensives using relatively small tactical units. And so far as the first point about Ukraine not exactly betting the farm on any of these axes, making that statement is never as simple as observers tend to make it out. Because saying Ukraine has only committed 3 or 4 or however many number of brigades to a particular offensive often misses the point. We often see small subunits of individual brigades put together and used for various missions. That obviously complicates the task of counting and tracking. But the best as we're able to tell, I think, from the images and reports available, the Ukrainians have so far held a lot more back than they've put in. Importantly, I also think there's evidence to suggest that a number of Ukrainian units may have made significant missteps. Whether it be about the spacing between vehicles, how minefields are handled, or what forces are allocated for a particular attack. I also think it's a simple military reality that they'll make more such mistakes before this war is over. Screw-ups are an immortal, omnipresent part of military history. But something that will be very important going forward is whether or not those mistakes are converted into lessons learned, that ultimately help to improve the results Ukraine achieves as it commits more and more of the reserve that it's built up. The second point, which I think has often been glossed over in some of the reporting I've seen, is this is not just a situation where Ukrainian forces are moving forward and bashing into prepared defences. The battlefield is more dynamic than that. In response to Ukrainians taking territory, the Russians have been launching a number of powerful and continuous counterattacks to try and reclaim positions. While in other areas of the front, say for example in the northeast along the Svatove-Kremina line, we've actually seen Russian units go onto the attack. So while we broadly describe this whole thing as a Ukrainian counteroffensive, there are lots of times and places where the line between the attacker and the defender at the tactical or operational level can become somewhat blurred. Another point is that particularly for the Ukrainians, it appears that a lot of effort is being directed not towards the seizure of territory per se, but to the counter-battery battle. That is the efforts of the Ukrainian artillery to hunt down and destroy their Russian equivalents. There are a couple of points of evidence that suggest to me that might be the case. The first is the complaints in some Russian sources that when they're trying to shell Ukrainian positions, the Ukrainian artillery, rather than focusing on the equivalent Russian positions, have focused squarely on hunting the Russian artillery, forcing the Russian artillery to focus instead on counter battery efforts. Because as much as gunners like shelling defenseless infantry or tanks in the distance, opposing tubes that are actively firing at you can often take targeting precedence. Basically the advanced doctrinal principle known as self-preservation moving into action. The second point of evidence is what Ukraine is claiming in terms of Russian equipment destroyed. Now, I've talked before about why I don't like to use the official claims of either side to work out the total quantities of equipment destroyed, but I am happy to look at them to help identify patterns. And here there's a pretty strong one. Historically, through the war up to the month of May 2023, Ukraine usually claimed to have destroyed more Russian tanks than Russian artillery systems. But between the 1st of May and the 21st of June 2023, Ukraine claimed only 306 Russian tanks, but 999 pieces of tube artillery and 71 MLRS systems, almost evening up the total of tanks versus tube artillery claimed. And that change in pattern is at least partially reflected in the change in the visually confirmed loss data, that is, the video and photographic evidence available to us. But over June, those numbers have been much closer together, and indeed there have been updates where there are more visually confirmed artillery losses than tank losses. Now, of course, there are plenty of alternative explanations to those data points coming together, but as it stands, it does seem to suggest that Ukraine has put great emphasis on knocking out Russian artillery, and that when Russian artillery has to unmask itself to repel Ukrainian assaults, those Ukrainian counter-battery efforts are being converted into destroyed Russian artillery systems. Okay, so if that's how the fighting has developed over the last 2 to 3 weeks, the next question I want to ask is, can the fighting tell us anything about the state of the various forces, their capabilities, their relative advantages, and also the attrition they're suffering? The first bit of information it's probably given to us relates to the willingness of Russian forces to stand and hold when on the defensive. This goes to one of the questions the Ukrainians must have asked themselves when planning this offensive, which is, What is the state of the Russian force opposing us? With drones or satellites, you can identify trenches, you can count pieces of equipment, you can estimate ammunition reserves, assess supply lines, and understand what it is you might be dealing with in a kinetic sense. But what is harder to assess from a satellite is what is the intention of your opponent and what will happen if you press them. Will they run? Will they surrender? Will they freeze up? Or will they fight hard to the very end? And based on some of the narratives we saw in the Western media before the counteroffensive began, you have to wonder whether there weren't some out there who thought Russian units would shatter if they were given a firm nudge. Like a leopard or two would come over the hill, the Russians would catch sight of superior Western engineering and flee before them. Now, of course, that was always a possibility, but so far it isn't what has happened, and it's also not what you would expect given observations of Russian forces in this conflict to date. While there were situations like Kharkiv, for the most part, Russian units on the defense have proven relatively resolute. Think about the paratroopers defending the defensive lines in Russian-held Kherson, for example, during that offensive. They held on despite reportedly very heavy casualties until the situation deteriorated so much that resistance was no longer possible and a withdrawal was ordered. Here again in Zaporizhzhia so far, we're seeing that some of the better units in the Russian army, when put in heavy entrenchments and defensive positions, are capable of defending quite stubbornly. That's not to say we haven't seen Russian units try to surrender or fall back, sometimes reportedly into blocking detachments. But so far it hasn't been enough to enable a wider breakthrough given the force that's been applied. The second point is that mines and fortifications are proving to be very significant obstacles. Breaching through a minefield under fire is always going to be a casualty-intensive exercise, and many of the losses we've seen of vehicles on both sides occur when those vehicles are fighting from within a minefield. It doesn't help the pace of any potential offensive when lanes through minefields have to be cleared before each stage of the advancement can take place. To use an analogy, you might be capable of running a pretty quick 100-meter dash, but doing it while simultaneously playing a game of the floor is lava might significantly increase the time it takes. And the situation is made even more complicated by the fact that both sides are using artillery-deployed mines on a relatively large scale. Reportedly in some cases to drop mines not in front of an enemy force, but instead behind it, either interdicting reinforcements or cutting off a line of retreat. Reinforcing and sustaining a push is always going to be difficult if an opponent can deploy one of their systems and then suddenly all of your resupply vehicles have to roll a d20 and explode on a critical failure. I'll also add that even though it might seem like quite a banal point, some of the Russian trenches and entrenchments we've seen dug by these units are actually pretty impressive compared to a lot of what we've seen in the war so far. We're not seeing as many of those simple slit trenches where Mobics were shoveled into and left to freeze in the early stages of the war. Instead, it looks like the extra time has gone into enhanced features, like dugouts that can protect from artillery bombardment far better than a simple slit trench, overhead protection, grenade sumps, and even little hollows on which grenades and other defensive aids can be stacked, ready to defend the trench at short notice. Many of you will have seen a particularly confronting video of some Ukrainian operators raiding into a Russian trench recently. If you haven't watched it, I would strongly advise against doing so. But in that video it was pretty clear that the Russian defensive system was relatively well developed, and I've seen some reports from Russian units engaged on this front that their positions have survived even almost direct hits from 155mm ammunition as long as the troops involved are in the deep dugouts. I think we've also seen evidence that both sides continue to learn and adapt their tactics. For their part, the Ukrainians have demonstrated new ways of combining infantry and vehicles during assaults. They've clearly begun leveraging the night vision capability of many of the new Western systems they're being provided with. And the Russians have reported the Ukrainians taking measures to protect their vehicles from Russian artillery threats, namely vehicles moving up quickly, assisting infantry with an assault, and then quickly withdrawing beyond artillery range, leaving the infantry and artillery to hold the newly taken positions. An important thing to note here is that many of the Ukrainian brigades stood up to support this offensive are going to be new. They're going to be primarily comprised of mobilized personnel who are facing combat for the first time. It's often said these units in some cases will be great because they've gone through NATO training, but they haven't gone through the same NATO training a recruit in the British Army or the US Army would go through. They've gone through an abridged basic program, and they're seeing combat for what might be the first time trying to conduct one of the most difficult missions an army can be asked to do. And I think that's something we should take into account when we assess the overall performance of some of these new brigades. On the Russian side, we've also seen a number of changes and potential improvements, although not universally applicable. We've seen some examples of the better integration of drones, the better use of electronic warfare and loitering munitions, improved artillery fire control so artillery fires are more responsive, and the assault tactics that Russian units use on the counterattack or just on the attack also continue to change and evolve, as we've talked about before. The lemming charge is still clearly in the rulebook, it's just much more rarely chosen as the default option. And it's also worth noting we've seen much greater use of aviation, that is fixed and rotary winged assets, to help blunt Ukrainian offensive maneuvers. Now all of that sounds pretty reasonable, but to be fair we've also seen some of the unreasonable. For example, we could dwell on this case where one enterprising Russian unit appears to have filled an old T-54 battle tank with 6 tons of high explosives, and then driven it towards Ukrainian lines remotely as a VBIED. Because apparently you don't spend years fighting in Syria without picking up a couple of things straight out of the ISIS playbook. Now notably, this attempt didn't really achieve anything. It also wasn't the only one. We've seen other attempts being made using MTLBs rather than T-54s as the base chassis. But while these incidents are interesting, they don't represent a wider pattern of behaviour yet. And so I think it's important not to let them become a distraction from the wider picture. Part of that wider picture is that Russia still has that advantage in number of artillery pieces and also still artillery ammunition supply, even if the rate of fire has slowed considerably. And as long as supply chains are intact, Ukrainian attackers are probably going to have to deal with a significant amount of Russian defensive artillery. A more novel observation surrounds the Russian use of rotary-winged aviation, so helicopters against the Ukrainian offensive so far. As we've talked about in the past, helicopters in the war in Ukraine have proven to be very vulnerable in many cases, and have usually been restricted to making pitch-up attacks using unguided rockets. But during the Ukrainian offensive so far, both Russian and Ukrainian sources have supported the idea that Russia is aggressively using its attack helicopters to blunt Ukrainian armoured pushes. This has been corroborated by a number of videos released by the Russian Ministry of Defense of Kar-52s seemingly using their long-range anti-tank guided missiles that can hypothetically reach out beyond 10+ kilometers to engage Ukrainian armoured targets that, at those kind of distances, probably aren't even aware the helicopters are there in the first place. While it's difficult to be certain, it's reported that this is at least part of what happened in Orikhiv. Russian Kar-52s engaging with ATGMs from the hover at very long distance. For their part, there are a number of factors at play that might have been distracting the Ukrainian vehicles. Namely the fact that when you're moving through a minefield, the first place you're training your eyes may not in fact be the sky. In some ways, the videos of the farm equipment being destroyed actually illustrates the engagement method well, although in those cases the pilots seem to have skipped the target identification stage. Now, with regard to the threat that these gunships pose to Ukrainian forces, I've seen 2 extreme opposing points of view that I think are worth addressing here, noting I'm only working with the information I have available to me. At one extreme, I've seen a lot of online commentary saying that Ukraine could have avoided these attacks if they just moved short-range air defences up with their forces. In particular, I've seen some commentators nominate the Flakpanzer Gepard as a good counter to these attacks, with the implication being that the Ukrainians were stupid, forgot to do this, and that's why they got destroyed. I think that response misses the scale of the threat for 2 reasons. The first is that these sort of short-range systems in Ukraine are relatively rare. The total number of Gepards pledged to Ukraine is only just above 50. Not all of those have arrived, and also this is a system that is being extensively used to shoot down incoming Iranian-designed Shahed drones. The Gepards do important work, a lot of important work defending Ukrainian cities as well as Ukrainian forces at the front, and there aren't always enough to go around. But beyond that, there's the point that the Kar-52 can shoot considerably further than the Gepard can. The Gepard may be able to see a Kamov engaging from maximum range, but it won't be able to hit it, nor will manpads or a variety of short-range missile systems. So really, you need a longer-ranged air defense system, probably a radar-guided one, in order to shoot these helicopters down. But at the same time, I'd be careful about deciding this is some new grave threat that's going to blunt any future Ukrainian offensive. The Kar-52 fleet is relatively small. It's been heavily attrited already, both by shoot-downs and also by continuous service. And while there are only claims with no supporting visual evidence, the Ukrainians at time of recording have claimed to have shot down 5 or 6 of the things over the last 7 to 10 days. Now, historically, the visual evidence for shootdowns often doesn't emerge for weeks or even months afterwards. And if we look at the war for a whole, generally speaking, we've had one visual confirmation for every 3 helicopters Ukraine claims to have shot down. If that pattern holds, that means maybe 1 or 2 Kharmovs have indeed been shot down by Ukrainian air defences adapting to this new threat. In which case you may actually see them grow more cautious going forward because there simply aren't enough airframes to support that kind of loss rate. At this stage, only time will tell. But as Future Purim would like to note here, given how valuable attack helicopter airframes are to the Russians at the moment, losing any of them over Russian territory fighting off Wagner of all people probably doesn't do much to support force sustainability. Which leads into a discussion of attrition and sustainability. Because in terms of understanding the impact that this offensive is going to have, it's not just important to watch how much territory changes hands, but also what sort of effort both sides are expending, and how well they're likely to be able to maintain that level of effort. Because as previously discussed, what we're seeing so far hasn't been a passive defense from the Russian Federation and its forces. A lot has been made of the fact, for example, that Ukraine hasn't advanced all the way to some of Russia's most fortified positions and belts of defences. But of course the reality is Russia isn't choosing to fight at those defence lines, it's choosing to move forces and materiel forward to aggressively counterattack or launch its own offensives, fighting many of these battles in the security zone. All else being equal, that should mean you'd expect a different loss profile for Russian forces than if they were adopting a more conservative defensive posture. And as a result, we've seen Ukrainian and Western sources claiming that Russian casualties now are spiking up to the same sort of levels we saw during the major Russian offensives around places like Bakhmut. But on the pro-Russian side, you've got an immense spectrum of answers as to how much attrition the Russians are suffering. Everything from the cheerleaders on one extreme of the spectrum who say that Ukraine is basically bouncing off invulnerable Russian positions and everything is fine and they're inflicting 15-1 casualties, to the more conservative but still optimistic among the Russian military bloggers, to those like Prigozhin who say that the Russian High Command is covering up the casualties and Russian forces are suffering extensive losses. Now, of course, none of those should be taken as reliable sources, so if we're going to piece together any sort of estimate, we're going to have to work a little harder. Because unfortunately, when you're trying to find the truth, you can't just pick the number that makes you feel good and go with it. Now, as with trying to assess Ukrainian losses, I think it can be tempting but ultimately is very deceptive to focus on high-profile individual incidents. For example, you could point to the Storm Ossetia Battalion. This was a battalion of several hundred volunteers believed to have been nearly completely destroyed on the Vasilivka axis. And so you could point to that and say, hey, look, Russia is losing entire battalions. They must be taking massive losses. But extreme individual examples often aren't a good proxy for the overall picture. So where we'd usually be left is using visually confirmed losses as our floor, Ukrainian estimates as our high point, and deciding that truth is probably somewhere in between but closer to the visually confirmed side. However, in this case, we might have access to at least one other potentially useful data point. One which helps us assess to what extent visually confirmed losses are short of reality. And in this case, that may actually be the Russian president himself. For roughly the first week of the counteroffensive, Ukraine claimed to have destroyed 74 Russian tanks. Visually confirmed losses for the Zaporizhzhia front from the 4th to the 16th of June, so for a longer period of time, were 15 Russian tanks. Normally, that would just be our soft range, with truth probably being somewhere in between. But on the 13th of June, so again after roughly a week, Vladimir Putin said that the Ukrainians had lost 160 tanks over the course of the counterattack so far, and importantly, that Russia had lost 54. Now that 160 Ukrainian tanks lost figure simply isn't credible given the forces involved. But I don't see any reason that Putin would exaggerate Russia's own tank losses. And a figure of 54 would mean the Ukrainians were only overclaiming by roughly 37%, and visual confirmations were capturing less than a third of actual losses in that period. Presumably because most operational security rules don't usually include a clause saying, yeah, you can totally take your mobile phone with you and use the internet as long as you promise to only use it for photographing burning enemy equipment and uploading it to the internet. Now, I'd be really nervous about extrapolating any of those findings out further. This is, after all, just 3 data points. But it does paint a picture of Russian forces suffering considerable losses while defending against the Ukrainian attacks. Another way of thinking about sustainability is to try and assess what percentage of available resources have already been committed. You'll often see in the comments section, for example, claims on both sides. Pro-Russian commentators saying that Russia has barely begun yet, that there is a reserve army of hundreds of thousands of men just waiting to be committed in Ukraine, just you wait and see. And on the flip side, of course, that Ukraine has barely committed any of its forces and it has plenty in reserve. We'll look at both of those claims now. On the Russian side, my assessment is Russia is probably pushing a majority of its available resources into this campaign in Ukraine and holding back this counteroffensive. That's contrary to Russian official statements, of course, but here's the thing about lying publicly. You need to make sure you lie everywhere in a way that checks out, otherwise you create discrepancies. For example, in Russia it was recently the day for honouring military medical professionals. There are a lot of medical professionals in the Russian military. They do a variety of jobs. Some are in hospitals, some are in recruitment and draft boards. And so the only professionals you would expect to get some combat experience are those specifically attached to combat units that get sent to the front, and then have to go through the unfortunate experience of trying to deal with shrapnel wounds rather than taking bribes in order to write a very honest statement saying that a potential conscript totally has bone spurs. Which is why I raised an eyebrow when recently the Russian Ministry of Defense disclosed that 70% of military doctors, paramedics, and medical personnel have received combat experience over the course of the so-called special military operation. That actually suggests a very high percentage of Russia's available frontline medical personnel have done rotations to the front and seen combat. Another clue about the rate of resource consumption and commitment that we're talking about here came after it was reported that Sergei Shoigu had visited a Russian tank plant in Omsk. After visiting Omsk-Transmashzavod, he also reportedly visited an artillery arsenal, where Lieutenant General Nikolai Parshin is reported to have said that from that base, 4,000 artillery mounts and systems had been reactivated and sent to the front, with 700 more due to be sent in the near future. That is a phenomenally high number, and would represent more than a fifth of all Russia's on-paper artillery reserves from before the war, sent from just one facility. And more than that, that's a fifth of the paper reserves, not counting those guns which are not serviceable, simply don't exist in the first place, are of the wrong caliber, or are so old that they would be of dubious serviceability. 3,000 of those reserve pieces, for example, are meant to be Model 1938s. 122mm howitzers with manufacturing dates between 1938 and at latest 1960. So if guns really have been disappearing out of storage at that sort of rate, that's significant. At the same time, the good general could, shock horror, simply be lying. And so you can probably guess where this is going. I decided to buy some imagery and figure out whether or not there was any truth to what the general was saying. Step 1 was finding the base that presumably sent the artillery pieces. This wasn't particularly hard. Omsk-Transmashzavod is relatively close to the 94th Arsenal, which would have made it very easy for Shoigu to visit both in one day. A quick check also revealed that local media covered the visit to the arsenal and carried some video which checks out with the satellite imagery of the base itself. Now, the local news article does contain one or two oddities. For example, it talks about 700 tanks being reactivated from the base in the near future, not 700 artillery pieces. But it does seem like pretty good evidence that Sergei got a great tour of the 94th Arsenal. Now, with respect to the commanders of the 94th Arsenal, I'm going to assume that Shoigu didn't have much time, and as a result, they didn't show him all the highlights of the facility. For example, the traditional Russian base garbage dump of all of these totally functional, easily restored vehicles. Or this secondary location with even more pristine, mint-condition equipment just ready to deploy to Ukraine at a moment's notice. I'm going to assume, now that I'm showing location number 3, you get my point about not all equipment that exists on paper being readily restorable. And so I promise I'll stop. Or rather, at least I'll stop after I show you a 4th location where again the Russians seem to have lined up and dumped decrepit and broken down vehicles. In any case, after staring at all the garbage dumps, I zoomed out and had a look at the base, comparing imagery from August 2022 with April of 2023. That's only a subset of the time period talked about, but smaller changes also make for easier counts. At the same time, we need to acknowledge the unknowns. We don't know how much equipment is brought into the base as well as sent out. We can only identify net changes, and we can't see how much equipment exists under overhead cover, like the sheds that you can see there in one half of the base. But very approximately, over that time period, about 500 pieces of equipment, artillery or support vehicles, were removed just from this section of the 94th Arsenal. Unsurprisingly, that's mostly coming from areas where the stuff looks to be in better condition. And that block of vehicles in the middle of the screen are the most interesting. Those are the big self-propelled guns, the 2S7 Pion. And as of several months ago, most of those had already been removed. So as far as the 4,000 figure goes, I still raise a significant eyebrow. And while the Russians have certainly done us all a favour by not adopting advanced counter-surveillance techniques like building roofs over the places where they store their vehicles, the fact that some roofs exist and that vehicles can move mean we're never going to be able to confirm a particular figure with any great confidence. But I have seen enough here to confirm that vehicles have been being removed from this base for months at a prodigious rate, which means either Russian forces in the operation in Ukraine have considerably more artillery than they started with, or they're going through barrels, mounts, and support vehicles by the literal thousands. On the Ukrainian side, there's a couple of things to say about the visually confirmed loss data. The first is that while most of the attention has focused on a couple of images of the destruction of Western military equipment, particularly around Orikhiv, the majority of the heavy armour that Ukraine has lost in the offensive so far hasn't been the Western supplied stuff. It's been old reliables like T-64s and BMPs. As for the Western supplied equipment, there are some categories where the losses already visually confirmed are fairly notable. 18 Bradleys so far, for example, although America almost immediately pledged another 15. A bit less than 10% of the Max Pro MRAPs and about 8% of the Leopard 2s, excluding the Swedish models. On one hand, those estimates are probably going to be too low because they're visually confirmed by nature and not every loss is going to be photographed. Although you should expect that if it is photographed, it will be released from 16 different angles day after day. As I noted before the offensive though, this wasn't an unexpected outcome. Equipment like this gives capability, not invulnerability. Heavy equipment like this is ultimately consumable, and if the war goes on, eventually all of what has currently been delivered will eventually be destroyed or worn out. The question is always going to be, how quickly, what's there to replace it, and what did the equipment ultimately achieve before it was lost? And as far as what these vehicles accomplish, crew survivability is pretty high up the list, at least anecdotally so far. And while it's sometimes easy to lose sight of when you're just counting equipment, that matters. If the airbag in my car goes off and saves my life, I'm going to be happy about the fact that it did what it was meant to do, save my life, rather than about the fact that I'm now going to have to pay to replace it. Anecdotally, the Ukrainians are claiming the crews of many of these knocked-out vehicles survived, and indeed some of the footage we have of these incidents not only lacks visible bodies in or around the vehicles, we also have some evidence of troops being evacuated from the scene. You're still going to lose troops inside Leopards or Bradleys, but you're probably going to lose considerably fewer than if they were inside BMPs or T-72s. More than that, if the vehicle doesn't catastrophically disassemble itself as a result of a turret toss, you may have a greater opportunity to recover the vehicle, which is something we have seen happen in a number of cases. And of course, if you're successful in an offensive operation and you end up being the one who controls the field of battle, you're the one with the prerogative to then recover any vehicles that survive. So Ukrainian losses so far seem to have been notable, but there's no reason to believe they'd be a barrier to further offensive action at this point. Part of the problem that Russian leadership might face when estimating Ukrainian losses and understanding the true nature of things on the battlefield is that their own reporting may not necessarily be accurate. We've talked before about the incentives in the Russian power structure and military to always overstate accomplishments and to cover up bad news. How the phenomenon of overclaiming benefits everyone in the hierarchy, except that is those at the very bottom who have to do the difficult fighting. Fortunately for the Private Conscriptoviches and Sergeant Bisepskis of the world, the Russian Ministry of Defense has found a way to make sure that they too can enjoy all the benefits that come from overclaiming, namely through the bounty system on destroyed Ukrainian equipment. In recent days, the Russian Ministry of Defense has made multiple posts on Telegram advertising the generosity and the frequency of payments under their bounty system. Under this system, if you or your unit destroy some valuable Ukrainian hardware, you get a monetary bonus. That might vary from 50,000 rubles for shooting down a medium UAV to 300,000 rubles if you shoot down a helicopter or a jet. From a point of view of over-reporting, this is great, because while shooting down Ukrainian jets to make your commanding officer look good might be very, very difficult, saying you totally did is very easy, makes him look good, and also might increase your pay for that month many, many times over. In terms of the Russian bounty figures for 2023, there are some interesting points in the data. The first is that nearly half of all claims are for shot down MLRS rockets or for medium-sized UAVs, with the bounty on those targets notably being the same as destroying an enemy's self-propelled gun. Now, on one hand, that's interesting because those are targets where the destruction is often going to be more difficult to verify than something like a burnt-out tank. And secondly, because you can imagine there being a perverse incentive issue with encouraging, let's just say, less than efficient engagement methodologies. If you command a Buk missile launcher, for example, and you see an incoming Gimler's rocket, it might not make sense to fire 2 of your missiles to try and shoot it down, at least from a military perspective. But you don't pay for those Buk interceptors and you get paid if you shoot it down. So maybe you potentially decide to get a little bit trigger happy in order to get yourself a little bit closer to a new larder. I say this not to allege a particular problem, but instead to point out how easy it can be to create perverse incentives that encourage negative behaviors in any organization, whether it be military or otherwise. Moving away from Russian claims then, the best available visual confirmation data we have suggests the following. Ukrainian losses in Zaporizhzhia spiked, especially in that first week of harder fighting. While the goal may have been to find weak spots in Russian defences, that doesn't mean that significant attrition wasn't being suffered and inflicted. Although especially in that first week, Ukrainian losses may well have eclipsed Russian ones. Past that point though, we've seen some rebalancing, and overall, visually confirmed data suggests more Russian losses for June than Ukrainian ones. Although given that we're talking about an offensive campaign through minefields against an opponent with an advantage in fires, it perhaps shouldn't be surprising that the ratio is far less favourable overall than what we've seen on average through the course of the war. On both sides, the casualties are significant but unlikely to be decisive in and of themselves, which is why it's important to talk about this offensive in terms beyond just the territory taken or the losses inflicted. There's a whole nother aspect of this campaign that needs to be talked about, and it has to do with the vital topic of supply and logistics. Because Ukrainian attacks on Russian frontline positions aren't taking place in a vacuum. They're taking place in the context of an ongoing strike and sabotage campaign dedicated to undermining Russian logistical support. Here it's useful to remember how Ukraine fought during the Kherson offensive. At Kherson, while the offensive carried on at the front, Ukrainian strike missions were regularly launched to destroy the bridges across the Dnipro River. The goal, of course, was to eventually undermine the logistical support for Russian troops on the right bank. Defending a trench behind a minefield might be easy. Defending a trench behind a minefield without food or ammunition is significantly harder. And so while the Ukrainian attacks didn't gain a huge amount of ground initially, as the Russian supply situation was placed under greater and greater strain, eventually you saw first movement and then eventually a Russian withdrawal. Now, the Russian positions in Kherson were on the wrong side of the Dnipro River, which made for some very clear and obvious logistical bottlenecks. In the case of the southern offensive now, there's no direct equivalent. The south of Ukraine has a relatively well-developed road network, for example. But there are, to be fair, 2 important caveats there. The first is that if you are the Russian army and you do not have palletized logistics and a relatively small supply of military trucks, then if you want to move large quantities of equipment regularly, you're going to need a train line. The Ukrainian forces, for example, have the benefits of railroads running to Kherson and Zaporizhzhia. But if you're the Russians, you really only have 2 options, and here I bring back a rail map from early 2022, complete with the red dots showing the Russian occupations or attacks that were relevant at the time, just as a bit of a casual reminder of how this war has evolved over the last 14 months. Rail traffic can either come in from the east, either landing at the port of Berdyansk or coming in from the Donbass, or it can come up from Crimea, whether it comes across the Kerch Strait Bridge or by ship to somewhere like Sevastopol. Cut or make unusable one or both of those rail links, and you're suddenly talking about much more strain on road-based logistics. The second factor to talk about is you probably don't need to physically occupy a train station in order to make the link unusable. Get within 80 kilometers and you might be able to sneak in some risky HIMARS strikes. Get within 40, you can launch those same strikes survivably from behind the line with less danger of things like lancets chasing you down. Get within 10 to 20 and the station may be receiving fire from tube artillery. And at that point, it's probably not nearly as useful as it was before. If your job, for example, is to be loading or unloading trains full of artillery ammunition, you're probably not going to get a thumbs up from OH&S if you're being shelled by the enemy while trying to do it. Ukraine's strategy so far seemed to have been both to target the supply links but also the suppliers themselves. In this respect, Ukraine's capabilities are considerably more advanced than they were during the Kherson offensive in 2022. The Ukrainians have more M270 and HIMARS systems than they did at that point, but most critically they have a supply of Storm Shadow missiles. And using Gimlers, Storm Shadow and a variety of other weapon systems, strikes on Russian supply depots and infrastructure have become a genuinely daily event. What you're looking at here was a warehouse and storage complex by the rail line in Rakovе. Now instead, the site is every property developer's dream, some flat land right by a rail transportation link, freshly cleared and ready for some medium-density residential development. Given the range, this was probably a Storm Shadow strike. But given the blast not only levelled the warehouses but also significantly damaged the surrounding area, I think it's fair to assume those warehouses weren't destroyed just by the warhead of Storm Shadow, but rather by a significant amount of extremely explosive stuff stored at the location. Other strikes again target the logistical links, as they did in Kherson. Recent strikes, for example, hit a number of the bridges from Crimea to mainland Ukraine. Once again, the Russians helpfully sent camera crews to the area to record the damage to the bridges and to report on it, confirming both that the target had been hit and also what damage had been done. Now, these attacks didn't entirely cut Crimea off from mainland Ukraine. There is an option to divert traffic at the expense of a much longer journey. And at time of recording, the Russians have already set up a pontoon bridge alongside the damaged bridges at Chongha. But as we saw during the Kherson campaign, a pontoon bridge is both A, vulnerable, and B, usually doesn't have the same throughput capacity as a properly constructed one. So time will tell how much pressure Ukraine chooses to put on this particular transport artery, noting that unless the United States agrees to supply ALCMs of its own or something like ATACMS, there's likely going to be very intense demand placed on Ukraine's limited supply of Storm Shadow and Scalp. Sabotage attacks on Russian railway, by contrast, doesn't require the use of expensive air-launched cruise missiles. Throughout June, we've both seen regular sabotage attempts on railways in occupied Kherson and Zaporizhia, but also over the last several months, a number of Russian trains being actively derailed. Now, sabotaging rails usually doesn't have a particularly long-lasting effect. Rail tracks are pretty hardy, pretty easy to repair, and Russia does have dedicated railway troops that can serve that role. But guarding hundreds of kilometres of track from saboteurs is difficult, especially if significant parts of the local population really don't want you there. Of course, Russia claims that 93% of the residents of Zaporizhia voted to join Russia in their totally legitimate referendum, so I have no idea who could possibly be supporting these rail sabotage efforts now. But jokes aside, there's probably a harsh reality that accompanies these Ukrainian attacks on Russian logistics. Namely, that you're probably never going to reduce the capacity of any transport system down to zero. There will always be an alternative route, there will always be a road, there will always be the option of getting Private Conscriptovich to strap it onto his back and ride there using a bicycle if that's what it takes to get supplies there. So it's not enough just to reduce throughput capacity, you have to increase demand as well if you want to duplicate the Kherson effect. And the harsh reality is that one of the ways to drive up the supply consumption for troops is to force them to fight, force them to expend ammunition and burn fuel, both of which need to be replaced, wreck equipment so more needs to be brought up, cause wounds that require medical evacuation or personnel replacement. War is not a game and it's almost never clean. And it may be going forward that we see cases of Ukraine trying to keep up the pressure, not just to take territory, but to simply drive consumption, to grind Russian forces down, and set the conditions for an eventual breakthrough. If so, it's likely to be messy, it's likely to be costly, but on the other hand, you could argue it's worked before. So where then does that leave us evaluating the offensive as we've seen it so far? The first thing to say is that we're still in the very early stages of it. We're still seeing Ukrainian attacks across a relatively broad front, potentially more aimed at drawing off Russian reserves or identifying weak points in the defences, rather than concentrating the maximum possible amount of combat power at a local level to force a larger breach. Yes, we have seen some very heavy equipment being deployed by both sides, but I think the available evidence suggests we're still some way away from the decisive phase of this campaign season. We know it's likely to be an ugly and costly fight, and we know the Russian media has already declared the operation a failure. But personally, I think calling this a success or failure at this stage of the operation makes about as much sense as calling a football match based on who takes the first attempted shot at goal. Those of you who followed the coverage through the Kherson offensive during 2022 might feel like you've seen this film before. Difficult Ukrainian attacks launched at multiple places along the front line, taking relatively little ground and resulting in the whole operation being called a dismal failure. Such a dismal failure, in fact, that it ultimately resulted in Ukraine raising their flag in Kherson. In terms of the offensive's success or failure, I would be cautious about overly focusing on territory taken as the metric for success. It's an attractive measure because it's easy to assess, it's accessible from space, and it's relatively objective. But it very, very seldom tells the whole story, especially in situations where territorial gains are unlikely to be linear. If you're attempting to breach a defense line, for example, you might spend weeks or months trying to finally crack it. But once you're through, many other positions may now be vulnerable to flanking or encirclement and have to be surrendered. In terms of pacing, I'd actually argue this offensive is sort of in the middle of the offensives that we've seen in Ukraine over the course of this conflict. It's certainly many times slower than the most rapid movements we've seen. This is not comparable, for example, to Russia's initial 2022 advances and retreats or to the Ukrainian operation at Kharkiv. But it's certainly much faster moving than the Russian offensives around Bakhmut or over winter, despite the fact that many of those battles were often covered as if they were grinding, inexorable Russian successes. I'm sure the Ukrainian military wishes that they were going faster, but I'm also sure the Russian military would have preferred it if they had made no ground at all. Moving forward, we can expect that both sides will continue to adapt at a tactical and operational level to try and gain a critical advantage, and the pace, nature, and success of those relevant adaptations will probably have a not insignificant influence on how this plays out in the weeks and months to come. But in the short run, we're likely to see more hard attritional, positional fighting, assaults and counterattacks, artillery duels, and the use of long-range munitions. Because one common feature of this war has been that when there is rapid movement, it's been enabled either by surprise or by attrition. Either because the defender is caught massively off guard, which wasn't going to happen here, or because forces have become so ground down they're no longer able to defend effectively. Kherson was enabled by a campaign of logistical strangulation and continuous attrition. The success at Kharkiv owed a lot to the fact that the Russian military was undermanned after the casualties it had taken fighting up to that point. And where we have seen Russian advances, they've often been achieved through the prodigious application of fires, attriting, grinding, and breaking down Ukrainian defensive positions metre by metre, block by block. So whether this offensive achieves any sort of manoeuvre phase is highly uncertain. More certain is that any movement would be preceded by a hard slog and likely also followed by another hard attritional slog. A cycle that will then likely continue until something greater, military, political, or economic, finally breaks in a bigger way. Part of the reason Ukraine has to fight this way is because their military is still missing critical capabilities from the West. This is both in terms of capabilities that are missing entirely, like a NATO 4th generation aircraft capable of doing ground attack missions, but on the other hand, also in terms of quantity, like the number of Storm Shadow missiles, the number of platforms capable of launching them, or even just the number of shells or armoured vehicles that have been supplied. I've seen arguments that so far the counteroffensive demonstrates part of the apparent issue with the way aid for Ukraine is calculated and provided, in that the focus seems to often be only on providing what Ukraine absolutely needs, rather than everything it would benefit from having. The offensive now is ultimately the result of aid decisions that were made 6 or 12 months ago. And so in oversimplified terms, you can imagine a process that goes something like this. Ukraine says it's going to need a certain amount of equipment to break Russian defences. Its allied countries look at the present situation and decide that really they only need about half of what they're asking for in order to break defences. Let's call that X minus 3. But by the time all that stuff begins to arrive, 6 or 12 months later, the requirements have increased because the Russian military has time to dig in and adapt. And now, because time has arguably been wasted, the new requirement to achieve the same effect is in fact going to be X plus 10. I think it's a strong argument for designing aid packages not based on what Ukraine presently needs, but rather based on putting the maximal amount of support possible into the pipeline. And then, if it turns out a capability ultimately isn't necessary after all, making the decision to withhold that assistance at the last moment once everything else is ready to go. Because in this sort of fighting, endurance matters. And barring any massive unforeseen developments, it looks like this war has a significant time to go yet. In the short term, Ukraine should probably expect some pretty large announcements from the West in terms of new support. Not least because the Pentagon recently announced they have overvalued military aid provided to Ukraine by a cool $6.2 billion US. This is because apparently the Pentagon used replacement cost for calculating the cost of goods sent to Ukraine, rather than a cost measure that reflects the fact that ammunition 1 week from expiry or an old M113 is not the same thing as a brand new projectile or a modern APC fresh off the production line. You might remember in a video as far back as February, I talked about the fact that I was pretty confident that this was happening, just based on an examination of what the US said was being sent and the stated cost of those packages. At the time, though, I just assumed it was a decision that had been made, not that it was an error. But now the issue has been discovered and disclosed, there's room in the US budget now for significant additional military shipments to Ukraine before we reach September and the end of the US financial year. But issues of aid and sustainability probably belong in another video at another time. Instead, I might close out by trying to put where we are into perspective. I think it's important sometimes to step back and look at the big picture because otherwise our expectations can change so much from time to time without us noticing. Sometimes just through the passage of time and sometimes through the deliberate actions of individuals or groups in the information space. Recently, for example, Russia appears to have moved the goalposts on what demilitarizing Ukraine actually means. From, literally demilitarizing the country, as one might expect, to forcing the Ukrainian military to use NATO hardware rather than Soviet-era hardware, which makes about as much sense as an argument as the police saying that they took away a suspect's knife, gave them a rifle, and as a result they had successfully disarmed the suspect. But by simply changing the definition of success, Russia was able to change an arguably failing campaign objective into one that has arguably been successful. And so in assessing how the war has progressed, it might be worth asking yourself a couple of questions. Namely, compared to a year ago, who holds the military initiative? Compared to a year ago, who controls more territory than before? Compared to a year ago, what is the relative balance of manpower, material on both sides? And compared to a year ago, what is the relative political and social stability of the competing powers? And on that last one, I might just add a little note here, that generally speaking, when the consequences of military mutiny and attempting to end-run your nation's capital are negotiations and a full pardon, then things may have gone downhill somewhat for you even if they're not yet critical. Where we are now is not the end of this Ukrainian campaign. It may not be even the end of the beginning of this Ukrainian campaign. And however this offensive ends, it's also unlikely to be the last one in this horrible war. It's extremely hard to say overall how it's currently going. Although, as is often the case, I'd suggest truth is probably not on either extreme. The offensive has neither failed, nor has it broken the Russian armies and driven to the Azov Sea, with waves of demoralized Mobiks fleeing before it. It would be fair to say in conclusion, however, that however the situation on the battlefield develops, what will arguably be more important are the signals sent politically by both sides. Can the West convince Russia that they're in it for the long haul and that a Ukrainian victory is inevitable, however long it might take? Or can Russia twist the battle of attrition and time to favour them? As with the ultimate results of this counteroffensive, only time will tell. Alright, brief channel update to close out, and I always do these last, which means I'm now doing this while very tired after sacrificing most of my night and early morning, watching a mercenary commander lead a mutiny and apparently try to thunder run to Moscow. I've made a conscious decision not to talk about Evgeny Prigozhin and his, shall we call it, creative method of negotiating with the Russian government and Ministry of Defense, but expect me to potentially pick up on the big picture implications of that topic once the smoke clears just that little bit more. Given the circumstances, I hope you'll forgive me for deferring most of my channel updates to next week, where I can promise to give a more comprehensive update. For the moment, however, I plan to get some rest. I wish you all the very best, and I'll see you all again next week.